Toxic people are rarely obvious at first glance. They don't walk into your life announcing their intentions. Instead, they blend in through charm, shared struggles, humor, or apparent confidence. Behavioral psychology teaches us that the most disruptive individuals often rely on inconsistency, emotional volatility, and subtle manipulation rather than open hostility. They test boundaries quietly, watching how much discomfort you will tolerate, how often you explain yourself, how quickly you abandon your instincts to keep the peace. Understanding this is critical because the smartest way to deal with toxic people begins with awareness, not reaction. When you mislabel toxicity as misunderstanding, stress, or that's just how they are, you give it room to grow. Toxic behavior is not about occasional bad days. It's about patterns. Patterns of disrespect, guilt-inducing language, emotional pressure, and control masked as concern. Once you train yourself to see patterns instead of isolated incidents, the confusion lifts and clarity begins to form. One of the most common toxic patterns is emotional destabilization. This happens when someone repeatedly pulls you into emotional highs and lows, praise followed by criticism, closeness followed by withdrawal. Psychologically, this creates a state of emotional dependency because your nervous system starts chasing resolution. You find yourself thinking about their mood, adjusting your behavior to avoid tension, rehearsing conversations in your head. This is not connection. This is conditioning. Toxic individuals often externalize responsibility, making you feel like their emotions are your job to manage. Over time, you may notice that conversations leave you drained rather than energized, confused rather than clear. The smartest response is not to confront immediately, but to observe. Observation restores your power because it slows the emotional pull. When you stop reacting and start noticing, you step out of the emotional fog and into a position of self-leadership. Another defining trait of toxic behavior is boundary erosion. Toxic people rarely respect limits. Instead, they reinterpret them as rejection, selfishness, or betrayal. Behavioral psychology explains this as entitlement paired with low emotional accountability. When someone feels entitled to your time, attention, or emotional labor, any boundary feels like a threat. They may push gently at first, disguising intrusion as need or vulnerability. If that works, the pressure increases. If it doesn't, guilt or anger often follows. This is where many emotionally intelligent people get trapped. Because they value empathy, they overextend it. But empathy without boundaries becomes self-abandonment. The smartest way to deal with toxicity is understanding that boundaries are not punishments, they are information. They reveal who respects your autonomy and who benefits from your lack of limits. Toxic people also rely heavily on narrative control. They reshape events to suit their self-image, often minimizing your experience while amplifying their own. This can look like denial, deflection, or subtle rewriting of conversations. Over time, this erodes your trust in your own perception, a phenomenon known as gaslighting. The danger here is not just emotional pain, but identity confusion. When you start questioning your memory, your feelings, or your judgment, you become easier to control. The smartest response is internal grounding. Instead of arguing over interpretations, anchor yourself in facts, patterns, and how interactions consistently make you feel. Emotional intelligence is not about winning debates, it's about maintaining inner alignment. When your internal compass is steady, external distortion loses its power. It's important to understand that toxicity is not always loud or aggressive. Some of the most harmful dynamics are quiet, passive, and socially acceptable. Chronic negativity, victimhood, subtle competitiveness, or constant comparison can slowly poison your emotional environment. These individuals may not insult you directly, but they diminish your energy, optimism, and sense of possibility. Psychology shows that emotional states are contagious. Prolonged exposure to negativity rewires your baseline mood and stress response. The smartest move is not to diagnose or fix these people, but to assess proximity. Ask yourself not who they are, but who you become around them. Do you feel smaller, tense, or guarded, or calm, grounded, and respected? Your emotional state is data. Learning to trust that data is a form of self-protection. Many people struggle with toxic relationships because they confuse endurance with strength. They believe that staying calm, patient, and understanding will eventually change the other person. But behavioral patterns change only when there is internal motivation, not external tolerance. In fact, tolerance often reinforces toxic behavior by removing consequences. From a psychological standpoint, what you allow becomes the standard. This does not mean you become confrontational or harsh. It means you become consistent. Consistency is powerful because it removes emotional drama and replaces it with predictability. Toxic people thrive on emotional reactions. They lose leverage when faced with calm, firm, and repeated responses. Strength is not about how much you can endure, but about how clearly you can choose yourself without guilt. Self-awareness is essential in this process because toxic dynamics are rarely one-sided in terms of participation. This does not mean you are responsible for someone else's behavior, but it does mean you are responsible for your responses. People with high empathy, conflict-avoidant tendencies, or a strong need for harmony are more vulnerable to toxic dynamics. Recognizing this is not self-blame, it is self-mastery. When you understand your own emotional triggers, such as fear of rejection or desire for approval, you reduce their power. Toxic individuals often exploit predictable emotional responses. When you regulate your internal state, you interrupt the pattern. Emotional discipline is not suppression, it is choice. It is the ability to pause between stimulus and response and act from values rather than impulse. Another critical insight is that not every toxic interaction requires confrontation. Psychology teaches us that direct confrontation can escalate dynamics when the other person lacks accountability or emotional maturity. The smartest way to deal with toxic people is discernment, knowing when to engage and when to disengage mentally. You don't need to explain your boundaries to someone committed to misunderstanding them. You don't need validation from someone invested in control. Silence, distance, and reduced access are often more effective than words. This is not avoidance. It is strategic energy conservation. Your time and emotional bandwidth are finite resources. Protecting them is not selfish. It is intelligent. Ultimately, dealing with toxic people begins with a shift in focus, from trying to manage them to learning how to manage yourself. When you prioritize emotional regulation, clarity of values, and internal stability, toxic behavior becomes easier to identify and less disruptive. You stop asking, "Why are they like this?" and start asking, "What is this costing me?" That question changes everything. It moves you from confusion to clarity, from reaction to intention. And from that place, you are no longer at the mercy of someone else's dysfunction. You are grounded, alert, and prepared to move forward with strength, restraint, and self-respect. Emotional discipline is the foundation that allows you to interact with toxic people without being pulled into their chaos. When your emotions are unregulated, you react quickly, explain excessively, or defend yourself against accusations that were never fair to begin with. Toxic individuals rely on this reactivity because it shifts control away from logic and into emotion. Behavioral psychology shows that the more emotionally charged a situation becomes, the less rational decision-making occurs. The smartest way to deal with toxicity is to slow yourself down internally. This means recognizing physiological cues, tight chest, shallow breathing, mental urgency, and responding by grounding yourself rather than engaging. When you regulate your nervous system, you deprive toxic behavior of its fuel. Calm is not weakness. Calm is control. Boundaries are often misunderstood as walls, but in reality, they are filters. They determine what behavior you allow access to your inner world. Setting boundaries does not require long explanations or emotional appeals. In fact, the more you explain, the more material you give a manipulative person to argue with. Clear boundaries are brief, consistent, and emotionally neutral. They communicate what you will and will not engage with, not what the other person must do. This shift is crucial because you cannot control others, only your responses. When you enforce boundaries calmly and repeatedly, You teach others how to treat you. Those who respect them remain in your life. Those who don't gradually remove themselves. Either outcome protects your emotional well-being. One of the hardest aspects of boundary setting is tolerating discomfort. Toxic people often react strongly when they lose access to you. They may accuse you of being cold, selfish, or changed. This is psychological pushback, not proof that you are wrong. Behavioral patterns resist change because change threatens control. If you give in to guilt, you reinforce the very dynamic you're trying to break. Emotional maturity means being able to sit with discomfort without abandoning yourself. You can feel compassion without compliance. You can acknowledge someone's feelings without absorbing them. This internal separation is what allows you to stay grounded even when others are emotionally volatile. Emotional restraint also means letting go of the need to be understood. Many people stay trapped in toxic dynamics because they believe that if they just explain themselves better, the other person will finally see the truth. But understanding requires willingness, not information. Toxic individuals often understand perfectly. They just don't agree or don't care. Continuing to explain drains your energy and keeps you emotionally invested. The smartest response is clarity within yourself. When you know why you're setting a boundary, you don't need external validation. Your peace becomes the confirmation. This internal alignment creates a quiet confidence that is difficult to manipulate. Another critical skill is detachment without bitterness. Detachment is not emotional shutdown, it is emotional selectivity. You stop overinvesting in outcomes you cannot control. You stop personalizing behavior that reflects someone else's unresolved issues. Psychology teaches that projection is common in toxic behavior. People displace their insecurities, fears, and anger onto others. When you recognize projection, you stop internalizing false narratives. You no longer feel compelled to defend your character against accusations that don't align with your values. This creates emotional spaciousness. You respond less, observe more, and protect your inner stability. Consistency is what turns boundaries into reality. A boundary stated once but not enforced becomes a suggestion. Toxic people test consistency because inconsistency creates openings. This does not mean becoming rigid or harsh. It means becoming reliable in your responses. When a line is crossed, you respond the same way every time, calmly, briefly, and without escalation. Over time, this predictability reduces conflict because it removes emotional negotiation. You are no longer arguing about respect. You are demonstrating it through action. This shifts the power dynamic quietly but decisively. Strengthening emotional discipline also involves redefining what connection means to you. Healthy relationships feel reciprocal, safe, and energizing, even during conflict. Toxic relationships feel tense, confusing, and draining. When you raise your standard for emotional engagement, toxicity becomes easier to walk away from. You stop romanticizing intensity and start valuing stability. You stop chasing validation and start choosing alignment. This internal shift makes boundaries feel less like loss and more like relief. You realize that peace is not something you earn by enduring chaos. It's something you protect by choosing wisely. Self-protection is not about becoming closed off or suspicious. It's about becoming intentional. You don't need to expose your vulnerabilities to people who haven't earned your trust. You don't need to share your plans with those who subtly undermine them. Emotional intelligence includes knowing when to be open and when to be reserved. This discernment keeps you from oversharing with people who use information as leverage. Privacy becomes a form of power, not secrecy, but self-respect. As you strengthen emotional discipline and boundaries, something important happens internally. Your tolerance for dysfunction decreases, and your confidence in your own judgment increases. You stop second-guessing yourself. You stop needing permission to protect your peace. Toxic behavior becomes easier to recognize and less tempting to engage with. This is not because others have changed, but because you have. You are no longer trying to manage emotional chaos. You are managing your own energy. And from this grounded position, you are ready to respond, not react, with clarity, restraint, and strategic distance that preserves your dignity and self-respect. Responding to toxic behavior effectively is as much about strategy as it is about emotional intelligence. The ultimate goal is not to change the toxic person, that is rarely possible, but to protect your energy, maintain your integrity, and preserve your sense of self. Strategic disengagement is not avoidance, it is intentional choice. It begins with assessing the interaction realistically. What is productive here, and what is simply feeding a cycle of drama or manipulation? Every conversation, request, or emotional demand is a data point. By evaluating these honestly, you decide whether engagement serves you or diminishes you. This clarity prevents reactive patterns from taking hold and ensures that every action aligns with your values rather than another's chaos. Once you decide on engagement, clarity of communication is essential. Speak succinctly, assertively, and without excess emotion. Toxic people often use confusion, over-explanation, or guilt to regain leverage. By remaining brief, factual, and calm, you reduce the chance of being manipulated. Your words should communicate boundaries clearly: what is acceptable, what is not, and what the consequences will be if those limits are ignored. Consequences are not threats. They are natural outcomes of boundary enforcement. For example, reduced access, limited availability, or withdrawal from certain conversations are all effective, non-confrontational responses. The power lies in your ability to uphold these consequences consistently without needing to argue, defend, or justify yourself. Equally important is restraint in emotional expression. Toxic individuals often provoke, test, and attempt to elicit reactions that feed their sense of control. Responding impulsively only validates the behavior. By maintaining composure, you remove the reward of emotional engagement. Emotional regulation in these moments signals that you are in command of yourself, not at the mercy of someone else's volatility. This does not mean suppressing feelings. It means observing them, acknowledging them internally, and choosing measured action. Calm restraint demonstrates maturity, discourages manipulation, and protects your psychological boundaries. Living this way is not always easy. Toxicity challenges patience, compassion, and courage. But by integrating behavioral awareness, consistent boundaries, emotional regulation, and strategic disengagement, you create a life where toxicity cannot dictate your state of being. You move with intention rather than reaction, preserving your dignity, your energy, and your sense of possibility. And in doing so, you demonstrate that the smartest way to deal with toxic people is not to fight them. It is to rise above them, fully grounded in the unshakable strength of your own presence. You become untouchable not through avoidance, but through mastery, clarity, and unwavering self-respect. Your peace, your focus, and your life remain yours. And that is the ultimate victory.